Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, August 10th New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And here's an interesting article to start with. Trump concedes there was some contractor error at Reflecting Pool by David Fahrenthold. President Trump on Sunday said on social media that the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool's problems were caused in part by some contractor error done by rushing the job for a July 4th opening. It was a change in rhetoric for the president, who had spent weeks falsely blaming the pool's problems on vandals. The Trump administration's efforts to rush through repairs to the pool, a national landmark, ended in disaster earlier this year. A hastily installed blue lining began to peel up, and new water purification systems failed to prevent a huge bloom of algae that turned the pool green. Trump responded to the tears in the blue lining with falsehoods, saying that it had been slashed by vandals. The U.S. Attorney in Washington, Jeanine Pirro, charged at least 7 people with vandalizing the pool, then dropped at least some of the cases after she discovered that the repair job had failed on its own. In his social media post, Trump also conceded that there was no video or proof to back up the assertions that vandalism damaged the pool. Still, he continued to blame one of the people who had been charged with vandalism, David Hearn, a former U.S. Olympian. Mr. Hearn had been charged with a felony by Ms. Pirro's office before his case was dropped. The pool remains drained for repairs. In his post, Trump said, "We are working on the pool and it will reopen shortly." Another article now. As voters grow anxious over AI, Trump shrugs off the concern. And this is by Tony Rahm. The rapid rise of artificial intelligence has started to rattle voters around the country, raising fears that they could be thrust from their jobs if the technology succeeds, or lose their retirement savings if the industry falters. But for all of the emerging doubt and political blowback, there has been no sign of concern at the White House, where Trump has generally maintained a much more sanguine view about the coming digital revolution. To the administration, AI can do little wrong. In recent weeks, Trump and his top aides have dismissed the suggestion that widespread automation could carry real negative consequences for families, businesses, and the broader U.S. economy. Even as the electorate grows uneasy about the technology and the data centers that power it, the president has only hardened in his view that AI will supercharge everything from medical research to military action. The political chasm between the president and the public has been most evident surrounding the red-hot issue of data centers, which Trump has defended as money machines, even as opposition widens nationally over the facilities. A small group of demonstrators interrupted one of Trump's rallies in Michigan last month to demand an end to data center construction. That incident came on the heels of similar protests around the country in a campaign organized by conservatives who otherwise support Trump's politics. Said Michael Strain, the director of economic policy studies at the Conservative American Enterprise Institute, said, "I think they are bullish about this technology." He said he generally agreed with much of the president's general approach in seeking to foster AI, and that he believed the technology would benefit the economy and national security, but he acknowledged the White House seemed to be less interested in preparing for the possible downsides. "It's a potential vulnerability for the economy," he said, "and one worth tracking and seeing how it develops." Trump may yet prove correct in his glowing assessment about AI, but his support has contrasted starkly with the more measured views from economists and policymakers across the political spectrum. Even among those who see AI as the most significant technological leap in human history, there is a sense that a disruption of this magnitude rarely occurs without consequences, and that Washington needs to be more prepared for every scenario. There is one view that AI can make workers significantly more productive and that the resulting gains could add significantly to global growth. Chasing that vision and the immense wealth that may accompany it, the largest technology companies, known as the hyperscalers, could spend as much as $5 trillion on AI infrastructure in the coming years, according to JP Morgan. That could require companies like OpenAI and Anthropic to generate significantly more revenue than they do now. That has delighted Trump, who has sought in his second term to increase construction and manufacturing. But there is also doubt among many experts that such an evolution is going to be frictionless. At the Stanford Digital Economy Lab, economists, including Eric Brynjolfsson, a widely cited expert on technology, have started trying to measure those early effects. In its latest update, published in July, the think tank reported a significant uptick in spending on AI infrastructure, but for now, no decisive evidence of a grand transformation to the labor force and to entire industries. Mr. Brynjolfsson said that the capabilities of AI would improve rapidly in the coming years, which would have profound implications on our economy, both in good ways, but also potentially with some real risks. The very concern prompted Mr. Brynjolfsson to help organize about 200 economists and AI experts earlier this year to issue a joint statement calling on government to build the incentives, guardrails, and institutions needed to steer AI in a direction that complements humans and benefits society. Recognizing some of the risks, the White House last week readied a long-awaited plan to monitor some AI models to ensure that they do not create security vulnerabilities. Developed in coordination with companies including Google, Microsoft, and OpenAI, it represented a departure from administration's hands-off approach toward the new technology. Otherwise, though, the White House has tried to position itself primarily as a cheerleader for AI. Michael Kratsios, the director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, said recently, "The narrative for so long coming from government prior to Trump has been so fixated on the negative impacts of this technology. Like, of course, people are skeptical." During the interview, he recalled attending an AI safety summit in the United Kingdom 2 years ago, which he said had focused on what could go wrong. That, he added, helped to crystallize the current problem facing the industry and the administration's rationale in sharing a more positive take about AI with the public. The only thing they're hearing from politicians and from people in industry is that, oh, there's going to be a bunch of job losses and everything is dangerous, he said, adding, "I think those are the things that get people worked up, and it shouldn't surprise us that the PR is bad." The Trump administration has struck its most bullish note on data centers, the growth of which has served as a flashpoint in elections around the country. Many cities and states have started to question the economic value of the facilities, which may support few long-term jobs once construction concludes, and the power, water, and other resources they demand. The concern has prompted some policymakers to halt data center construction, including in New York, where Governor Kathy Hochul enacted the first statewide moratorium in July. In response, Trump lashed out on social media. Demanding a reversal to the policy, the president said the facilities would generate taxes and jobs that amounted to, in his words, liquid gold, adding that data centers are tremendous wins for the states and communities that are lucky enough to get them. The White House did not respond to a request for comment. The New York Times has sued OpenAI and Microsoft, claiming copyright infringement of news content related to AI systems. The two companies have denied the suit's claims. In an attempt to tamp down voters' mounting concerns, Trump did broker an agreement earlier this year with technology companies that included those companies paying for needed electricity upgrades. But the pact, which is voluntary, came as the president appeared to doubt openly whether there was even an energy cost problem to begin with. "They need some PR help," he said at a March event, referring to the public relations image of data centers. "Because people think that if a data center goes in there, electricity prices are going to go up. And that's not happening. It's not going to happen." Lawmakers in 15 states, nonetheless, have considered such bans targeting data centers over the past year, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, which last updated its count in July. Last week, Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky, a Democrat, also signed a new directive meant to protect residents from electricity price hikes from data centers, while Governor Greg Abbott of Texas, a Republican, required new projects to submit to an energy audit. Trump still appeared to criticize some of the moves. Singling out Texas, he told Punchbowl News that its actions were a mistake, adding of data centers, it could be bigger than oil. The full-throated endorsement of data centers has increasingly put the president on the opposite side of his fellow conservatives, who have long been skeptical of the nation's largest technology companies. Among the most vocal is Humans First, an advocacy group led by Amy Kremer, a former Tea Party leader, who helped to organize the Stop the Steal rally on Facebook after the 2020 presidential election. She said she used AI every day and was not wholly opposed to it, but she said policymakers at all levels of government had failed to chart the future of the technology in a way that accounted for the public's anxieties. People are very, very upset, she said. They feel like there's a disconnect. They feel like no one is speaking for them. She said her group helped to organize a day of protests against data centers in 42 states last month. She fretted that the nation's largest technology companies had bought their way into Trump's inner circle and had shaped some of his approach to the issue. I think the people around him definitely know the backlash, she said, and I just hope that he understands what people are thinking and feeling. But the pushback has hardly appeared to rattle the public optimism of the administration. Speaking weeks after the conservatives' protest, Kevin Hassett, the director of the White House National Economic Council, still sought to downplay some of the national trepidation around AI and data centers. I don't think anyone should be worried that a data center is going to be plopped on top of them, he told Fox Business in late July, adding that the deals between tech companies and local communities around the facilities have been negotiated pretty generously. If you take a sleepy town that hasn't really seen much in the last 20 or 30 years and put a data center there, he said, then there are going to be a whole bunch of happy residents in that town. And a somewhat related story. Traffic to Trump's Truth Social falls sharply this summer. This is by Matthew Goldstein. President Trump is a commanding presence on Truth Social, the platform he co-founded in 2022. But despite the fervent media attention that his policy pronouncements and personal attacks on the site attract, traffic to the social media platform has fallen sharply this summer. Last month, the overall number of monthly visitors to Truth Social was down about 36% from a year ago, according to estimates by the online tracking firm SimilarWeb. Monthly visitors to the site fell by a slightly greater amount in June compared with last year. By contrast, much bigger social media platforms such as X and Threads have posted higher numbers of visits this summer. SimilarWeb, which is a widely cited provider of internet traffic analysis, found that for the first 7 months of 2025, the average number of monthly visits to Truth Social was 28 million. For the same period this year, the number was 25 million. I've been following traffic to Truth Social for years, and I'm really struck by the steepness of the plunge, said Howard Polskin, who publishes a newsletter called The Writing, which tracks the right-wing news media. When you think of how much Trump uses Truth Social as a megaphone, you would think the numbers would be skyrocketing. A Truth Social spokesman declined to comment. The traffic slump at Truth Social comes at a critical time for its parent company, Trump Media, the publicly traded company Trump co-founded. Last month, the company rolled out a product to sell Wall Street traders instantaneous access to Trump's posts in what was widely seen as a means to give subscribers an edge in buying and selling stocks and other widely traded assets. Trump Media, which has yet to produce much in the way of advertising revenue on Truth Social, is charging firms up to $100,000 a month for this first look at Trump's posts. The new product has drawn controversy and concern that Trump is trying to monetize his policy pronouncements and boost Trump Media's stock price. Some Democrats on Capitol Hill have said the sale of early access poses a conflict of interest and gives traders willing to pay for it an unfair advantage in the nation's stock, commodity, and possibly prediction markets. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. So far, Trump Media has found 10 customers, mostly trading firms, for the fast feed of Truth Social posts. Trump Media is betting that more trading firms will want faster access to Truth Social, given the ability of the president's posts to move markets. Here's a disturbing article. It's rather long. It's called "Flock Cameras Can Track Every Car in America. Police Love Them. Citizens Don't." It's by Fernando Alfonso III and Kashmir Hill. Driving down a road lined with strip malls outside Dallas, Philip, a 27-year-old cell phone tower repairman, was describing the exquisite piquancy of his homegrown hot peppers when he stopped mid-sentence. "Flock," he said, pointing to a traffic light pole at an intersection. Attached to it was a small black box with a camera that takes photos as cars drive by. It was a license plate reader made by Flock Safety, based in Atlanta, that alerts law enforcement when it spots wanted cars and allows officers to see where cars of interest have been. Philip pulled into a strip mall parked outside a dentist's office and opened an app on his phone. The app, called DFlock, invites people to view and contribute to an open map of public mass surveillance devices. He zoomed in on the intersection on the digital map and plotted the location of the camera. Philip asked that his full name be withheld because Flock's chief executive, Garrett Langley, once called DFlock terroristic. To Philip, DFlock is about pushing against the proliferation of cameras that capture the ordinary moments of ordinary people. "And what's my way of pushing back? Education, data," he said. "Am I just being paranoid? No, they're actually everywhere." Flock's 120,000 cameras can be found alongside roads in every state but Alaska, allowing law enforcement officers to see within seconds where a car might be and where it has been. The company has contracts with 7,000 law enforcement agencies, which is 40% of all departments in the U.S. Other companies sell license plate tracking services, but Flock, a private company valued at $8.4 billion, has become a lightning rod because of its rapid expansion, the ubiquity of its cameras, and a number of controversies involving its product. A Texas officer used Flock's cameras to track a woman across state lines who was suspected of self-administering an abortion. Officers across the country have abused their access to Flock's cameras, including to track romantic partners, resulting in discipline and termination. Los Angeles and Dayton, Ohio, among other cities, recently suspended their contracts with Flock to prevent immigration authorities from accessing data from the cameras. Dayton resorted to covering the cameras with trash bags. In cities like Houston, Oakland, and Grand Junction, Colorado, residents have taken matters into their own hands, with police reports and surveillance footage documenting Flock cameras being cut down, splattered with paint, and even shot. Flock's pitch is simple. It can help the police find stolen cars, locate wanted people, and solve crimes. One license plate reader led to the arrest in Florida of a man who had threatened a mass shooting in Louisiana. Another helped police find the man eventually convicted in an assassination attempt against Trump. But as its cameras have spread, so has the opposition. Americans are accustomed to surveillance cameras. They put them on their doorbells and tolerate them on street corners, offices, and restaurants. What sets Flock's cameras apart is that they're connected, creating a vast, searchable national network, often surprising residents who didn't realize their local governments had signed up for them, and raising fears of Big Brother-style surveillance. And they're hard to miss. In late May, Hannah Faust's neighborhood group chat was abuzz about a license plate reader that had been installed on her street in Carrollton, Texas, a suburb of Dallas. Then another camera was spotted outside the recreation center across from the community pool. All of us really got the ick, Ms. Faust, 41, said. Mr. Faust, who said she leans left, Ms. Faust, who said she leans left politically, began posting about license plate readers on Reddit groups devoted to Dallas and Carrollton, and started a digital petition to have the cameras removed from her community. By late July, she had collected roughly 800 signatures from neighbors, some of whom also spoke out against the cameras at a Carrollton City Council meeting. I'm very much your average American. I vote, but I've never organized or been really an activist in any way, said Ms. Faust, who works in human resources and has 2 children. I'm not committing any crimes, but I don't want necessarily anyone, let alone government agencies or a private company, to have a view of where I drop off my kids, or what route is my favorite for my commute, or whether I prefer H-E-B or Kroger, or what house of worship I attend. Noticing cameras and posting about them on Reddit led a software engineer named Will Freeman to create DFlock in 2024. He was on a road trip from the West Coast to Alabama and kept seeing cameras along the way. He decided to create a crowdsourced map to plot the devices in Huntsville, Alabama, where he was living, and the project went viral. The app has been downloaded by more than 350,000 people, he said, and the site says it has mapped 125,000 license plate readers made by Flock and other companies. Mr. Freeman, 27, now lives in Boulder, Colorado, which also has a contract with Flock. The city says its 31 cameras have led to a 34.5% decline in motor vehicle theft and helped solve other crimes. Mr. Freeman, however, said he did not think that privacy should be sacrificed for safety. The cameras create an infrastructure for the government to track and harass critics, he said, even if most officers aren't abusing their access. Wanting to know when his own vehicle had been spotted, Mr. Freeman requested these records from Boulder Police Department, which refused to provide them. In May, he filed a lawsuit against the city, saying the cameras created an unconstitutional, warrantless surveillance dragnet. The city declined to comment on the suit, but in legal filings it said there is no reasonable expectation of privacy on publicly owned streets and sidewalks. It feels bad to always be watched and scrutinized, Mr. Freeman said. Across Texas, the opposition to the cameras has been bipartisan. Flock's contracts have been canceled in liberal Austin as well as in Bandera, a conservative hill country town of about 900 people. The city said at least one of its cameras was vandalized. In Congress, Keith Self, a Republican whose district lies north of Dallas, introduced a bill in July that would require federal law enforcement agencies to obtain a warrant before accessing or querying data collected by state and local surveillance systems, license plate readers among them. We have a surveillance state happening, said Mr. Self, who is also a retired Army colonel and former county judge. This is not a left issue, not a right issue. It is a personal issue. Texas opposition may be attracting attention, but it hasn't slowed Flock's growth. Across the state, new cities are signing contracts faster than others are canceling them, said Jennifer Shemansky, a spokeswoman for the Combined Law Enforcement Associations of Texas, a police union that represents more than 28,000 officers. The reason, she said, is impressive results. Some Texas police departments recovered stolen vehicles by the hundreds after installing the cameras, she said. And in smaller municipalities, vehicle burglaries have all but stopped. Despite community complaints, officials in Harris County, which operates 480 cameras, and Carrollton, which operates 67 license plate readers, including 19 from Flock, are not changing their minds about the cameras. Independent research on the camera's efficacy is sparse. A 2024 study found that Flock's cameras increased officers' case clearance rates by 9%, but 404 Media, among others, criticized the findings because Flock had partnered with the researchers and chose the agencies that were part of the study. States are starting to create rules for how police can use the technology. To address the concern about rogue officers abusing the system, 13 states now have laws requiring audits of license plate reader systems to detect misuse by officers. Texas is not among them. Ms. Szymanski said that the risk of Texas officers misusing the system was no greater than with the other databases they have access to, and that Flock provides a log of every search, who conducted it, and why. And here's a disturbing story. Top science body deletes climate chapter from Judge's Manual by Karen Zrake. The nation's top scientific body has removed a chapter on climate science from a reference manual for judges after an outcry from critics on the right, including Trump. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine said Friday that it had determined that questions about the processes used to develop the chapter warrant an independent review, and the chapter will not appear on our website while that review is underway. The chapter appeared in the fourth edition of the Reference Manual on Scientific Evidence, which was produced in partnership with the Federal Judicial Center and was released last year. The 1,700-page manual covers many different topics and is intended to help judges understand science and technology that might come up in cases. Other subjects covered in the manual include eyewitness identification, toxicology, and neuroscience. Climate change is figuring into a growing number of legal cases, including lawsuits against oil companies over their role in global warming, as well as other cases involving government regulations, natural disasters, insurance claims, land use, and the energy industry. The now deleted chapter was the manual's first foray into climate science. The Federal Judicial Center, which is a government agency, removed the chapter from its website in February after criticism from Republican attorneys general and other officials. The National Academies, which operates as a private scientific advisory body under a congressional charter, declined to do so at the time. In a separate development last month, the National Academies issued a report on a type of research known as attribution science, a growing field that examines whether specific extreme weather events, such as a particular storm or flood, were intensified or made more likely by climate change. The report concluded that research of this type was getting more sophisticated and yielding better data. 3 days after that report was released, President Trump launched a broadside against the National Academies, writing on Truth Social that the organization was run by radical left Democrats and that taxpayers should not be funding climate fraud. He called for a review of its funding. As of Monday, the chapter in the Judge's Manual had been taken off National Academy's website and replaced with a short paragraph explaining that it had received considerable scrutiny. In a statement, the National Academy said its review is about the process used to produce the chapter and not about the validity of climate science. The focus is on our procedures and whether they were adequate to ensure the highest standard of objectivity that this institution requires and our nation deserves. There's broad scientific consensus that global warming is being caused by the burning of fossil fuels, which releases greenhouse gases, mainly carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases act as a blanket, trapping the sun's heat and warming the world. It was unclear how long the review might last. And for a complete change of pace, here's a health story. It's called He Suddenly Shuffled When He Walked. Why? By Lisa Sanders, an MD. His wife was the first to notice. They were walking to a restaurant in downtown Huntington, New York on Long Island. She was trailing a little behind, chatting with her sister. When she glanced up to watch this man she'd been married to for 50-some years, she was shocked to see an old man. At 72, he was hunched over, creeping along, barely lifting his feet off the ground. When had he gotten so old? "Honey, stop shuffling," she called out to him, a hint of irritation in her voice. "I'm not shuffling," he replied indignantly. He denied it for weeks, but finally acknowledged that his gait really was different. Somehow this thing he did every day had become harder. His legs felt weak, his balance a little iffy. That was 7 years ago. Since then, they'd seen many doctors. His internist sent him to a neurologist. He had an MRI to look at his brain and an MRA to look at the blood vessels within it. Lots of blood tests. A specialized scan seeking evidence of Parkinson's disease, which didn't find it. The MRI report showed some spinal stenosis where the bones crowd in on the spinal cord in his neck and in his lower back. An orthopedic surgeon said there was nothing on the MRI that would account for the way he was walking and nothing bad enough to require surgery. He saw more neurologists, more orthopedic surgeons. Surely someone could explain the strange new way he walked. He had more MRIs. He had EMGs to evaluate his muscles and nerves. None offered any explanation. He went back to the orthopedic surgeon. His neck didn't hurt, but he wondered, couldn't the stenotic narrowing there affect his legs? It could, the surgeon agreed. He didn't see any evidence that there was significant compression of the spinal cord, but he agreed to operate anyway. After the surgery to widen the stenotic bones and a month of rigorous physical therapy, the man was still shuffling. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. He saw yet another neurologist. This one ordered a second scan looking for Parkinson's. That one showed a small defect in the substantia nigra, the twin commas deep in the back of the brain where dopamine is stored. That finding suggested he did have Parkinson's after all, but the defect seemed too small, the Parkinson's too early stage to explain his very altered gait. Still, it was worth a try. He started the man on a medication for Parkinson's called Sinemet. When there was no improvement after a month, he stopped the medication. Yet another neurologist disagreed. He was certain the man had Parkinson's and restarted the medication. But when the shuffle didn't abate, even at the highest dose, he too conceded that it probably wasn't because of Parkinson's. The patient was frustrated. As he moved from doctor to doctor, his walk and balance continued to deteriorate. The COVID pandemic kept him out of specialists' offices for nearly 2 years. Still, his wife continued her search for a doctor who could help. Finally, she turned to hospital for special surgery. She looked up the neurologists on staff and started calling. The third doctor she tried agreed to see her husband and then referred him to an HSS neurologist named Alexander Stilbans. Stilbans, a specialist in movement disorders, listened as the patient, assisted by his wife, described what he felt. His legs were strangely heavy, leaden and awkward as if they were stuck to the ground. He could walk for only a few minutes. After that, he felt as if there were a rope around his middle, keeping him from moving forward. Stilbans watched as the patient walked up and down the hallway. The man's steps were short, with one foot barely ahead of the other, yet his stance was strangely wide. His left arm swung normally by his side, but his right arm hardly moved when he walked. On examination, that arm and leg were stiff and a little hard for the doctor to move, even when totally relaxed. The doctor reviewed imaging of the patient's head and spine as the couple sat waiting nervously. Finally, he spoke. Two things were quite clear, even from this first look, the doctor said. Based on the Parkinson's study in his exam, he did have a little Parkinson's. That's why his right arm and leg were stiff. But that wasn't what was making his walk so abnormal. He pointed to one of the MRIs that showed the patient's brain. Cerebrospinal fluid is made in spaces in the brain known as ventricles, he explained. And if you compare two of the images done several years apart, he said, you can see that the ventricles in the later image are larger than the ones in the earlier image. The patient couldn't see a difference, but the doctor continued. That change suggests there is increased pressure in the brain, the result of having too much fluid in the ventricles and the surrounding brain tissue. That excess exerts extra pressure on the delicate tissues of the brain, which can injure them. Despite this physiology, the disorder is called normal pressure hydrocephalus, because when measured in a spinal tap, the pressure is often normal. But in fact, there are waves of high pressure that occur over time. Only in the last quarter century have doctors been able to measure the pressure in a way that reveals that fluctuation. We make just over half a fluid ounce of spinal fluid an hour, about 17 ounces in a day. At any given moment, we have around 5 ounces of cerebrospinal fluid in circulation. The fluid travels through the brain and spinal column before being absorbed by the veins at the top of the brain. Think of water pouring through a sink. What drains from the basin has to move as fast as what comes from the faucet. If it doesn't, the sink overflows onto the floor. So it is with the spinal fluid in the brain, except that there is no floor, no place for the fluid to overflow. As we age, the cycle of making and absorbing spinal fluid can become less efficient. When the drain doesn't quite keep up with the faucet, the fluid, which is not compressible, puts pressure on the brain tissue, causing dysfunction and ultimately permanent injury. It isn't known exactly what causes the mismatch. The creation of the spinal fluid seems to be constant. What usually changes is the brain's ability to absorb the stuff. The symptoms of normal pressure hydrocephalus stem from this increased fluid. The disorder is characterized by a trio of symptoms. Most commonly, patients have gait changes. They might also develop urinary incontinence or dementia. If caught and treated early, the symptoms may be reversible. It's a common disorder in the very old, affecting more than 1 in 20 adults over the age of 80. It's often missed because the three symptoms can be caused by other diseases also common in the elderly. Treatment involves placing a tube into the brain, which allows the excess fluid causing the pressure to drain into the abdomen. Stilbens referred the patient to Dr. Michael Kaplan, a neurosurgeon at Weill Cornell Medical Center. Because NPH is hard to diagnose, Kaplan wanted to be certain that this was what the patient had and that the treatment would be helpful. So he ordered one more test. The patient was admitted to the hospital where a tube was inserted at the bottom of his spinal canal and a small amount of fluid was drained every hour. After 24 hours, the patient was instructed to walk down the hall. He was amazed. The heaviness in his legs was gone. He hadn't felt this good walking in years. It was all he could do to keep from running. 3 weeks later, the patient had the surgery to place a permanent shunt. Again, the difference was immediate and profound. Before the surgery, he could barely complete a single lap around the pool in his yard. Now he's walking 2 or 3 miles a day and working with a trainer to regain the strength he lost. He's not quite as fast as he used to be, but as he reminded me, he's 79 years old. And to his wife's great relief, and his own, when he walks, he no longer looks or feels like an older man. And here's an article that I hope you'll be interested in. I'm interested in it because I taught the Odyssey for many years. So it's by Frank Bruni, and it's called Adieu, Odysseus, Enough Already. I don't minimize what Odysseus went through. Scylla, the Cyclops, the suboptimal bedding and plumbing in the Trojan horse, it's a lot. But if we're being honest, there were mercies as well as furies. He found uncrowded beaches. He didn't need Orange Theory or Ozempic to stay slim. And ancient Greece didn't share modern America's enervating penchant for taking anything that has been deemed a major cultural event and inflating it until it bursts, chewing on it until it's mush, critiquing it in so many different media and exploiting it for such diverse purposes that it becomes intrusive and obnoxious, like a scrum of suitors with bad table manners camped out just a few feet from your loom. If I see or hear one more word about Christopher Nolan's new version of the Odyssey, I'm going to hurl myself into the nearest Charybdis. That's a whirlpool. I like the movie fine. The vistas, the vestments, a cast so overloaded with talent that the Oscar winners Charlize Theron and Lupita Nyong'o are reduced to cinematic throw pillars. I've spent 3 hours in much, much worse ways. But 3 hours was hardly the end of it. The movie's blockbuster opening weekend was an open invitation for commentators to commence commentating, intellectuals to initiate intellectualizing, moralists to moralize. The chiming in was clangorous. The piggybacking was gluttonous. A timeless allegory became a teeming trough, which I guess is an allegory's job. It insists on consideration, demands interpretation, means to be molded along political, psychological, and spiritual lines. But along culinary ones too? A recent article in Bon Appetit remarked not only on the ick factor of the entrail stew that Circe serves to Odysseus' shipmates in Nolan's movie, but also on the dubious historical accuracy of that slop. According to the food magazine, Greeks were more likely roasting goat and sheep and pairing that protein with a dense barley-based bread. I await a chain of Odysseus-inspired bakeries. Au bon Penelope. Perhaps you didn't leave the Odyssey wondering what kind of chief executive Odysseus would be. That's okay. Forbes has you covered. The business magazine published an article promising 3 key lessons for leaders in the Odyssey, And just in case that wasn't C-suite tutorial enough, Forbes subsequently examined what the movie teaches leaders about great storytelling. Clearly, Homer's epic poem, it's not an epic, it's a romance, but we'll let that go. Clearly, Homer's poem, the source for Nolan's movie, belongs not in the literature section of the bookstore, but on the self-help shelves, possibly retitled How to Win Friends and Influence Athena, or The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Ithacans, or Who Moved My Feta. I tip my hat to the journalism just mentioned. It's enterprising and entertaining, but when you add it to the travel-related articles from Forbes, Reuters, Variety, about Favignana, the Sicilian island that played Ithaca in the Odyssey, and then throw in think pieces about the movie's meditation on family, faith, duty, defiance, loyalty, treachery, courage, and cowardice, you wind up with oceans of material that could take, 20 years to navigate. Processing Nolan's Odyssey is its own odyssey. On one hand, I'm delighted by any movie, any musician, any sporting event with an appeal broad enough that, for a short while, a true mix of people who usually travel in discrete tribes and speak in specific dialects discover a common interest and a shared vocabulary. This has been a summer of such nexus. The championship run of the New York Knicks, the World Cup, Odysseus in IMAX. But the digital age has a way of turning excitement to exhaustion, of reducing everything to content to be molded in whatever fashion a given messenger or medium desires. I think back to Taylor Swift's Eras Tour and how the magic of it evaporated a bit with every new exegesis on its significance, or how every other Super Bowl must generate a dozen subplots and serve as a social mirror. And the memes, always the memes, they began even before the Odyssey hit theaters in mid-July, and they were indisputably clever. One smart Alex strand of social media mischief made fun of the IMAX ideal for Odysseus viewing by showing people using, say, a smartphone instead. The scene in which Matt Damon, as Odysseus, is lashed to a wooden pole and cries out in agony as he hears the sirens sing yielded so many jokes that there were separate reflections on that bounty. And here I am reflecting on that. Pundit, heal thyself. I don't have a solution. The internet's going to internet, burying us in lotus leaves of distraction. We have to summon the individual will to stop munching on them. I now pledge to do just that. Having shamefully bent the Odyssey to my own ends, I'll now leave Odysseus to his Ithaca and his indolence. And here's an opinion piece called Has America Already Undergone a Soft Breakup? This is by Kurt Anderson. I actually think, Rush Limbaugh told his many millions of listeners during the weeks between Trump losing the 2020 election and his supporters' assault on the Capitol, that we're trending towards secession. It can't go on this way. There cannot be a peaceful coexistence of two completely different theories of life, theories of government, theories of how we manage our affairs. 20 months later, on the day the FBI seized thousands of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, the Times reported that posts on Twitter that mentioned civil war had soared nearly 3,000% in just a few hours, and jumped again a few weeks later after President Joe Biden branded Trump and MAGA Republicans a threat to the very foundations of our republic. Days after Charlie Kirk's assassination, then Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene reiterated her push for legally splitting up the country. I want a peaceful national divorce. Our country is too far gone and too far divided, and it's no longer safe for any of us. Polls since 2021 by universities, YouGov, and others have consistently found that a third or more of Americans said they expected a civil war during the next decade or so. A national divorce, let alone a civil war, is for now the stuff of fiction. But while loose talk from rabble-rousers has distracted us, the nation has sunk almost unnoticed into an unspectacular yet profoundly strange new arrangement. It's not yet a divorce. It's more like a bitter, loveless marriage in which the parties stay technically but less and less enthusiastically united because splitting up is too complicated or dreadful or expensive. From its start, this country has been a tricky balancing act, the states acting in their own narrow interests, but also together as a union. That delicate equilibrium is central to federalism, the Constitution's mechanism for sharing authority and power between a national government and far-flung states. But for the past dozen or so years, the more blue parts and the more red parts of this purple country have arrived at a variety of ad hoc governing arrangements, apparatuses, and alliances with which to thwart each other or the federal government. The names for this dynamic are uncooperative federalism and more recently, soft secession. During the past two Democratic presidencies, many red states and counties declared themselves Second Amendment sanctuaries, prohibiting their police forces from enforcing some federal gun regulations. The term was a trollish play on Democratic sanctuary cities, which did the same for federal immigration policies. Governor Greg Abbott of Texas took it upon himself to override federal immigration policy, deploying the National Guard to string the banks of Rio Grande with coils of razor wire and ordering his troops to prevent federal border agents from helping migrants who got tangled in them. More than 24 Republican governors endorsed the show of anti-federal strength. Now that Trump is back in office, Democratic-led states and cities are getting almost as aggressive, overriding or ignoring federal and state policies they find objectionable. Local police departments aren't cooperating with immigration and customs enforcement. Many states passed laws to shield residents from prosecution if they are charged elsewhere with facilitating abortions, and several have stockpiled abortifacients in case federal law or regulations make them hard to get. Various combinations of blue states have banded together to perform functions the federal government has abandoned or degraded, forming a climate alliance that participates in international forums that the Trump administration won't attend, creating de facto regulatory agencies for cap-and-trade carbon markets, issuing medically legitimate childhood vaccination recommendations. A coalition of a couple dozen attorneys general has sued the administration over birthright citizenship, tariffs, and denial of federal funds to Democratic-controlled states. In the group's frequent online group meetings, as we reported last fall, the same phrase keeps coming up, though nobody wants to say it publicly: soft secession. We've been here before. In the first half of the 19th century, when southern states invoked states' rights as a means to defend slavery against the will of the rest of the country. Yet as tensions rose over the next 3 decades, presidents focused on preserving the peace and keeping the states united. Today, by contrast, we have a president apparently determined to widen the divide, and who has made it clear again and again that he will reward those states and cities that voted for him and severely punish the others for their perceived disloyalty. As far as our national union goes, the United States has definitely passed the good faith couples therapy stage and onto continuous mutual mistrust and contempt. Each side is engaging in what therapists call triangulation, enlisting friends and family members who take their sides. We have fully entered the judicial stage of marital hostility with mediation, custody fights, restraining orders, and all. Still, the unhappiest couple can stagger on together for a long time, living together in one household with shared assets but separate calendars, friends, bedrooms, and lives, occasionally engaging to scream at each other before returning to their default postures of silent, sullen loathing. Even in the lead up to the Civil War, decades passed between 1832, when South Carolina declared a federal law null, void, and no law, and 1861, when Confederate troops fired the first shots. So what is the path out of today's angry domestic standoff? Built-in tensions between Washington and the states make periods of soft secession to some degree inevitable. The century of relative domestic tranquility between the Civil War and civil rights depended on the awful compromise of Jim Crow. When that finally proved unsustainable in the 1960s, the national confrontation was fierce. A measure of calm returned and lasted for half a century, but it too was bound to end. A peaceful national consensus and more or less well-functioning democracy aren't going to spontaneously revive. A generation ago, a little-known junior senator named Barack Obama bucked us up with his heartfelt insistence that there is not a liberal America and a conservative America, only the United States of America. He encouraged us not to slice and dice our country into red states and blue states because we are one people. Isn't it pretty to think so? Since then, we have sliced and diced ourselves pretty thoroughly. We can't keep going this way. Escaping federal dysfunction and avoiding real hostilities over the long term will require some kind of radical shift. Perhaps states and regions can become much more independent, like the regional autonomous communities in Spain, some of which collect nearly all the taxes their inhabitants pay and then forward a negotiated share to the national government. Or Switzerland, where cantons can divide or reconfigure, and each one decides whether newcomers become Swiss citizens. Even that might not be enough. Someday down the line, we may decide we have no choice but to call it quits. If so, I hope we could follow the lead of post-Soviet Czechoslovakia, whose 1993 breakup into two nations was so calm it was called the Velvet Divorce, a kind of conscious national uncoupling. For our huge, heterogeneous country, it would be extremely difficult and painful, but in the long run, it still might be better for the kids. And we'll conclude with a few letters to the editor. Here's one on an article called Trump's Arch Could Alter the Fabric of Washington. This is from Gloucester, Massachusetts by an architect and the former board president of the Historic Districts Council of New York. The proposal for a bombastic, useless arch in Washington is simply appalling. Inserting this massive chunk of vanity into one of the most considered urban designs in our history is a huge affront to the people of the United States. After a lifetime of preservation work in New York City, I, as well as my colleagues, know that the desecration of a viewscape is as damaging as the blow of a sledgehammer to important urban spaces and landmarks, spaces and monuments that mean so much to so many. This needs to stop. And here's a letter on an article called Dozens of States Tried to Roll Back Vaccine Policies. How did it go? With sadness and dismay, I continue to follow the Trump administration's unconscionable crusade to roll back long-established and successful vaccine policies, emboldening many states to act. Trump and his advisors seem determined to take us back to a time when countless children and adults succumbed to the ravages of contagious disease. Proven science has given us the miracle of vaccines that bestow immunity against these life-threatening diseases. The current administration is anti-science and is vigorously engaged in misinformation and falsifications concerning the effectiveness and safety of vaccines. We are rapidly returning to a pre-science era when ignorance and quackery held sway. It is shocking to think that thousands of children and adults will suffer and even die as a result. A public outcry is needed to persuade those in power to change course and once again be guided by good science. And that's written by a clinical professor at the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. And here's a response to an article called, After Trump Calls Canadians Nasty, Mark Carney says the word fits trade talks. Can you imagine if a leader of a foreign country referred to Americans as nasty? Picture the outrage, the anger, the indignation among the American public. Well, that's the word your president used to refer to Canadians recently, repeatedly. Any wonder why many of us Canadians don't feel like visiting the United States? I spent time in 35 states before this man was elected and met some of the nicest, most generous people there. I haven't been back since. And that's a letter from Quebec. And we'll end with this gem. Flight is canceled after a child refuses to be seated, by Johnny Diaz. A flight from British Columbia to Toronto was canceled on Thursday after a child would not sit down and buckle a seatbelt before takeoff, the airline said. Porter Airlines Flight PD444 had left the terminal at Victoria International Airport in British Columbia and was headed for the runway when crew members saw a young child who was standing in the seat and would not secure its seatbelt, the airline said in a statement. Attempts by the accompanying parent and crew to address this were unsuccessful, according to the company, which did not provide the age of the child. The aircraft could not take off in this unsafe condition, so the crew elected to return to the terminal and have the passengers disembark. The time required to bridge the aircraft, deplane the passengers in question, retrieve their baggage, refile flight plans, and other paperwork meant that it was too late to depart because the airport's runway closes at 12:30 a.m. A spokeswoman for the airport confirmed that the flight was canceled because of the airport's scheduled airfield closure. It was not clear how many passengers were affected. The plane has 132 seats, according to an airline spokesman. We apologize for the effect this had on other passengers who were able to depart on a flight the following day. The new flight departed from Victoria International Airport at 10:49 p.m. local time on Friday and arrived in Toronto at 6:16 a.m. local time on Saturday, according to FlightAware.com, which tracks flights. There's a child who may need some disciplining. Just a guess. Anyhow, you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is Ted. I hope you enjoyed it, as always. And as always, I enjoyed reading. And I look forward to talking to you next week. Have a good week. Bye.